Hello, it's week 11, and the title of today's lecture is From Social Cognition to Affect. And essentially what we're going to focus on is trying to understand how our cognitive processes, so our kind of thoughts, interplay with and are able to predict emotional experiences. And what I want you to try and take home from today's lecture is firstly to understand the differences between certain key words, so understanding what affect, preferences, evaluations, moods and emotions refer to. So these refer to overlapping concepts, but there's some important distinctions between them. I also want you to understand the theories behind how we categorize distinct emotions, or distinct or discrete emotions. So how do we understand or determine whether love is an emotion, or anger or fear? Secondly, I want you to be able to explain the different physiological theories explaining emotional experience. So in other words, how arousal might underpin the emotional experience that we encounter. And this is going to involve a kind of review of the sort of classic James Lang Cannon-Beard theories. We're also going to focus on the facial feedback hypothesis. So how our facial expressions can feed back and give information about the emotional experience that we're encountering. And finally, I want you to be able to explain the different cognitive theories accounting for emotional experience. So there's a range of different theories that account for different aspects of the emotional process. So these fall under theories related to interruption, matching outcomes, and managing goals. And finally, we're going to focus on how differences in appraisal can influence emotions. Okay, so let's begin by defining and categorizing some key aspects of affect and emotion. And if we begin with affect, this is a very generic term that refers to a range of preferences, evaluations, moods, and emotions that we feel. And we can have preferences towards objects, but if we're thinking about the kind of social psychology literature, when we talk about preferences, it's normally with respect to people. And these preferences reflect a relatively mild evaluative response. For example, relating to whether we like somebody, dislike somebody, are attracted to them or unattracted to them. Moods, on the other hand, refer to less targeted and generic states where we typically experience either positive or negative affect without any real cause for it. So for example, if you were to think about your mood at the moment and somebody asks, "How are you?" you're likely to reflect on whether you're currently in a good or a bad mood. And this is useful, but it will be a pretty limited experience if the only thing that we're able to express to others is "I feel good, I feel bad." This would kind of be like a sort of caveman emotional response system that we have. So what we end up also possessing is more discrete assortments of affect that fall in between being happy and sad. And we refer to these kind of differentiated affect as emotions. So for example, we can feel joy, anger, fear, as well as being able to feel amusement or delight. And these experiences we label as emotions typically are much more fleeting responses than our moods. And they're also synchronized to specific events or stimuli. So this kind of event or stimuli can be something as simple as a comment from a friend who says something negative or maybe gives you some kind of compliment, or it can be something tangible in the environment, or even something that you think about using your imagination. So if you picture yourself in a particular situation or a particular set of events occurring, this can evoke a specific type of emotion. However, a lot of the time, there isn't any real strong distinction between emotions and moods, and you can find that one can often lead to the other. So for example, if something occurs that makes you feel joyful, then you're also by default much more likely to be in a more positive mood after this. Okay, let's think about now how exactly do we go about characterizing or categorizing all of the different emotional responses and emotional experiences that might occur to us. And it turns out that this isn't a straightforward question to answer, and there's been a reasonable amount of debate over it in the literature. But it appears relatively convincing that there's sort of two possible solutions for how you might explain this or reflect it. And one of these is illustrated in a bipolar structure, and another is a bivalent structure. Let's have a little look at these two approaches. So the bipolar structure was proposed by James Russell in 1980, and he argues basically that emotions, so any kind of emotion that you might experience or think about, fall somewhere along a dimension of pleasantness and unpleasantness. So some emotions are highly pleasant, such as being content, happy, or kind, whereas other emotions are highly unpleasant. For example, when you're feeling blue, or you're grouchy, you're lonely, or you're sad. And the idea is that these emotions fall somewhere along this continuum. So you can't have an emotion that is at the same time experiencing happiness whilst also experiencing sadness. So it's somewhere along this gradient that you're going to feel an emotional response. And the second dimension he proposed varied according to the level of engagement. So you had emotions that have strong levels of engagement, such as feeling highly aroused, astonished, or surprised. And you have other emotions that relate to low levels of engagement, such as quietness and stillness. And for the most part, it seems a relatively intuitive model and makes a reasonable amount of sense. However, it's not the only option. So when Watson and Tellegen a few years later performed a similar sort of analysis, so in this kind of analysis, they're taking every self-reported levels of emotional responses, and they identified two different dimensions that emotions relate to. The first was that emotions correspond to high and low levels of positive affect. So, for example, whether you're excited or elated versus feeling dull or sluggish. And that they also vary from being high in negative effects, such as you're feeling fearful or hostile, compared to low negative effect when you're feeling kind of calm or relaxed. And it's only at the very high ends of both of these that you experience high levels of arousal. So when it's kind of high levels of positive effect or high levels of negative effect is associated with that high arousal. And you might think, if you're looking at these two models, what difference does it make how we classify these? And there's not too much to choose between them, but there are some reasons to think that the bivalent structure of Watson-Tellegen is a little bit more precise in terms of how we actually are classifying these. And this is mainly for the fact, if you ask people to indicate on self-report measures of how much positive effect are you feeling at the moment or at a particular time or retrospectively, then you find that there's actually no correlation between individuals' level of positive effect and their self-reported negative effect, which suggests that these two dimensions are unrelated to each other. So the dimensional analysis of human emotion that we've just covered is useful. So understanding things according to the kind of pleasantness or levels of positive and negative effect. But it still doesn't really answer the question of how do we decide what exactly is and isn't an emotion. So for example, if you're standing at the bottom of a mountain and you're looking up, is that experience or the sense of awe that you might have, does that classify as an emotion? What about the feeling of being alienated against and the sense of rejection that you get? Can you classify that as an emotion? Or that warm feeling you get when you're watching cat videos for an entire afternoon, does that count as a separate emotion? And it turns out that it's a pretty tricky question to definitively answer what is and what isn't an emotion, and it's the kind of thing that researchers will spend their lifetime squabbling over. And I think a reasonable solution to understanding what is and what isn't an emotion is to approach it from a prototypical view. So an effective approach could be to categorize emotional states based on their relatedness to prototypes that we have of particular emotions. So in other words, we could develop a prototype for a particular emotion such as anger, and our prototypical anger emotion would involve a high level of increase in our heart rate. We would have an internal sense of rage, so some kind of cognitive component, and then that might also be associated with a kind of facial response of putting on a scowl on the face. Similarly, joy, there'll be a prototype of joy that will involve you kind of smiling, having enthusiasm. You might like to seek out others at the same time. You're kind of more excited, you feel bubbly and energetic. And what we would do then is go and categorize our current emotional state that we're feeling, based on its closeness of fit to the prototypical emotional state. Now, an important question is understanding what emotions are considered kind of basic or fundamental. And there's no real kind of clear consensus on these. So if I asked you to write down now 5 emotions that you think are sort of fundamental emotions that are universal, that everybody experiences, then you would probably start off with, and you'd find it relatively easy, and you would probably write down emotions such as fear, anger, potentially anxiety, sadness, happiness, joy might be on there, surprise. But there's a kind of core group of emotions that you're able to think of. But actually defining exactly what falls on there, again, is not straightforward. So you have some early work that's based on kind of getting people to categorize which emotions go with which. And you find that there's a sort of cluster of 5 emotions that went together of love, happiness, anger, sadness, and fear. And that was some work in the 1980s by Schwartz and Shaver. Now, you have others that have tried to understand basic emotions through facial expressions. So, for example, Charles Darwin was one of the first to explore this, and in his textbook called The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, he was the first to put forward the idea that the young and the old of widely different races, both with man and animals, express the same state of mind by the same movements. So basically, he was there suggesting that you can understand people's emotional responses just by looking at the facial expressions that they're making. And if you can think now of who might have extended this work, then Paul Ekman is probably the name that would come into your mind. And he picked up on Darwin's argument and proposed that there are specific basic emotions that are part of our kind of evolutionary heritage, and that these emotions, we share them with primates and other mammals, and precisely because they're part of our kind of evolutionary heritage, he argued that we share these across cultures, that they should be universal, that wherever you go, whether it's speaking to kind of Inuits or going to the Zulu tribes or speaking to tribes in Papua New Guinea, then everybody should recognize these same facial expressions. So if I went up to a tribe in Papua New Guinea and I put a big scowl on my face, then the leader should be able to detect that I'm angry with something. And this is generally known as the kind of classical view of emotions. And you can also consult the Oracle of Pixar's Inside Out, and you will see the same sort of perspective there as seeing joy, sadness, fear, anger, and disgust. So a very nice study that was published recently by Alan Cohen and Dacia Keltner. This was published in August 2017. And they argue essentially that rather than there being this kind of 5, 6, or 7 basic emotions, that you can capture up to 27 distinct emotional experiences. And in the study, they've tried to understand emotional states by showing people a series of videos. So they took 2,185 short video clips. And these are the kind of video clips, and we'll look at some of these in a minute, but they're kind of ones that you'd see on YouTube or kind of encounter on Facebook. And they show sort of everyday and wide-ranging experiences. And they were designed and selected so that they would cover a wide range of emotional experiences that they're likely to elicit. And then they took 850 participants and showed each participant a small selection of these video clips and asked them to rate them on a number of different affective dimensions. So kind of like the things of saying how arousing this video is, what's the sense of dominance that it gives you, what's the sense of certainty, but basically dimensions that are known to be relevant for determining a kind of emotional response to this. And this ended up giving a total of kind of just over 300,000 individual judgments. And with all of this data, you can then do a kind of very sophisticated cluster analysis to understand what sort of emotional patterns So which emotions are being detected, so which emotions are distinct from each other, and also understand how these emotions are related to each other. Okay, so we can also look at exactly how these emotional states are represented in space. There's a very nice interactive illustration that's been created by Cohen and Keltner to go with the paper. And basically what they've done here is to create a two-dimensional map that illustrates the relationship between all of these emotional states. So remember that the analysis that they're doing is kind of in multi-dimensional space. It's very difficult to illustrate that. So instead what they do is put it in a kind of 2D space, but you can see that there's clusters of emotions, such as at the top left you have anxiety, fear, horror and disgust, that form a kind of common cluster. And then you have these sort of, and this is one of the key arguments that they present, is that you have these gradients between these different emotions. So for example, there's a gradient that transitions between the emotion of anxiety and fear. And what's really interesting on this interactive is you can click on any of these particular points on the map and look at the exact stimuli that participants were shown that elicited this type of emotional state. So for example, this clip is eliciting anxiety. If we move up here, we can look at one of these that's tagged with Q is corresponding to a fear response. And you'll notice some of these, when you click on them, will be blurred. And they've censored a lot of these. There is a way to look at the uncensored version of the stimuli. So here we are looking at something that elicits fear, and this is a kind of ethereal sort of ghost that's moving that you'll be able to see on the top left. As I was saying, there is a way of uncensoring this. I would highly recommend not uncensoring it. I've done it, I've looked through some of them, and I think I regret it now. There's some pretty morbid videos on here, and that's probably the case for a lot of these that elicit horror. Similarly, we can look at some that elicit disgust. So you have a rodent that's died and is kind of bloated and decaying. And if we go down to some of these that elicit awe, yeah, you have some fun stuff that's down there. Let's check out this one. So a lot of kind of visual illusions tend to fit into the kind of the awe emotional response. But I guess key is the fact that you have certain clusters, for example, nostalgia up here that's by itself, craving that's down here, whereas for others you do have between amusement and awkwardness, there is a kind of gradual transition between the two. So very interesting to explore. And if you look up the top right hand side, this is the different emotions that they were being asked to rate each of these on. So again, when you click on each of the stimuli, you'll see the average ratings that participants gave them. Okay, so we should now have a much better idea of exactly what an emotion is and how it might be characterized. But an important question that we're going to focus on is where exactly do these emotions come from? So what gives rise to you feeling the emotional experience of, say, happiness or fear? One of the earliest approaches to understand this was proposed at roughly the same time by William James and Carl Lang. According to what became known as the James Lang theory of emotion, our experience of emotion is directly the result of the arousal that we experience. So this approach proposes that the arousal and the emotion are not kind of two independent things, but rather the emotion depends on the arousal that we're experiencing. So it's not the case that fear occurs alongside a racing heart, but this emotional response of fear would arise simply because of the racing heart and arousal. So in other words, if you were to see a bear that's in the woods, we end up being afraid of this because we initiate these physiological responses of trembling, our heart rate increases, we run away and show some kind of avoidance response. And it's these that lead to and characterize the emotional response. So a fundamental aspect of the James Lange theory is that we have very different differentiated patterns of arousal that lead to different emotional experiences. And in a similar way to this, Darwin had proposed that the kind of relevant muscular activity in the face can then sort of strengthen or inhibit an emotion. So for example, if you have activation of the zygomaticus major muscle, which is in the face, this initiates smiling, and you smiling will kind of strengthen the emotion of joy or happiness. Now, as influential as it was at the time, the James Lange theory was challenged by Walter Cannon, who was a kind of prominent American physiologist, and he weighed in with a pretty devastating 5-point critique of the James Lange theory. First of all, Cannon noted that paraplegics can still experience emotion. So even though their spinal cord has been severed, which effectively prevents them from getting any sort of direct feedback from their skeletal muscles or levels of kind of viscera and arousal, but they were still able to experience emotion. So in other words, if you can still experience emotion but you have no sense of your bodily responses, then surely the bodily responses and arousal cannot really explain emotions. This is kind of a pretty damning argument, and it's the sort of point where you could just put your feet up and stop there. But Cannon went on. So second, he argued that you have different emotions such as fear and anger do not seem to be associated with different patterns of bodily reaction. So if you record the physiological response of a person, for example, their heart rate, their blood pressure, the hormone responses, it becomes very hard to accurately and consistently distinguish between the two different emotions. And you'll see this in psychophysiology recording. If you're trying to understand what emotion somebody is actually feeling at a time, it's very hard when you're using whatever kind of sophisticated equipment. It's very hard to get an accurate reading of exactly what emotion they're feeling. Number three, along the same sort of line, a third critique was that our perception of visceral responses to stimulation are diffuse and non-specific. So in other words, we cannot perceive small changes in arousal and adjustments of the autonomic nervous system. So basically, we're not very good at having a kind of intuitive perception of our autonomic system. So you might notice if there's a large change in your heart rate, but if there's a small change of kind of 2-3 beats per minute, it's not necessarily easy to have any kind of introspective insight on this. Fourth, he argued that autonomic responses at least recruit much more slowly than emotional responses, which makes it difficult for autonomic responses to actually cause emotional states. So in other words, if you think about winning a prize in a lottery, when we find out that we've won that prize, we might experience a state of kind of joy or happiness. But this emotional experience occurs before we end up displaying the full physiological response associated with that kind of event. And finally, his fifth critique of this was that if you find experimental manipulations of autonomic responses, so for example, speeding up or slowing down the heart rate, don't really seem to alter subjects' emotions too much. So essentially, that sort of racing heart and sweaty palms that you could be experiencing at some time, that could indicate passion, but it could also indicate fear. It could be excitement, or it could be anger. And this is one of the arguments that's particularly taken up by Lisa Feldman Barrett, that if you listen to the Invisibilia podcast, she'll extend on this perspective. And based on the previous discussions of the issues regarding the James Lange theory of emotion, Cannon himself put forward a separate theory of emotion that you don't need to worry about too much here, but it was based on thalamic processes whereby a kind of bodily changes occur almost simultaneously with the emotional experience. So the bodily changes and emotional experience occur separately and independently of one another. Physiological arousal does not have to precede the emotional expression or experience. Now, if we take Cannon's assertion here that our arousal is too diffuse or non-specific to indicate a particular emotion, and instead arousal just simply ranges from kind of high to low, which I think most people would almost undoubtedly view as being correct, then we're left with the problem of how we go about accounting for this rich texture of emotions that we experience. So if it's not simply physiological arousal that can be an explanation for the different types of emotions that we experience, what might be a decent explanation for this? And just take a second to try and think. And any idea? So if you were thinking cognition here, then this is basically heading in the right direction. But we're going to leave cognition for a bit and come back to that later, because there are some theories that argue that physiology might still hold the key to explaining the richness of emotional experience. And specifically, one idea that's adopted this approach is the facial feedback hypothesis. So if you remember that Cannon's first criticism of the James Lange theory was that these paraplegic individuals who could receive no afferent impulses from their skeletal musculature, they could nonetheless experience emotions. And this seemed to rule out James's emphasis on the perception of muscular activity. However, Cannon's critique did leave open the possible role of the facial musculature. So if you remember that these paraplegic patients still have feeling above the level of the neck. One of the kind of early proponents of facial feedback hypothesis was Tompkins, and he proposed that emotional events directly trigger innate neural programs, which then generate a corresponding display of emotion on the face. So the purpose of this display is primarily to kind of communicate your emotional state to other people. So it serves some function. But Tompkins also proposed that, and this is consistent with the James Lange theory, that feedback from the facial expression is there to generate the subjective experience of emotion. For example, if something good happens to me, this would activate subcortical regions that then evoke activation of what's known as the zygomaticus muscles. So these are the ones that are kind of in the lower cheek. And this is going to cause you to smile. And the facial muscles then provide feedback that leads to my conscious experience of the positive emotion of happiness. However, a lot of the actual evidence for the facial feedback hypothesis is somewhat limited to being able to distinguish between pleasant and unpleasant emotions, and also between high and low levels of arousal. So you find evidence that when people's facial expressions change in their level of pleasantness or intensity, and this is measured by asking observers just to rate how pleasant do you think someone's face is, or how intense is their facial features, then this tends to correspond quite well with physiological changes. So for example, if someone is perceived to have quite an intense expression on their face, then this will correlate with measures of skin conductance that indicate activation of the sympathetic nervous system, so indicating that they have high levels of arousal or intensity. Similarly, you find evidence that if you attach electrodes to the face that allow you to record very kind of small activation of the facial muscles, so too small to be able to visibly perceive it, then the activation of these facial muscles will reliably index positive affect that's experienced when participants are viewing affect-laden stimuli. So if you show somebody a series of images, so kind of positive and negative ones, then their rating for the positivity of these images will correlate with the activity that's in these facial muscles. And Facial expressions are also argued to directly influence reported mood, emotion, and evaluations. So you get some extra evidence for this perspective. It also comes from some nice research by Hen and Lotter et al. This is a paper in 2008 that looked at patients who had received Botox injections to the face for cosmetic reasons. So Botox has the function of rendering people unable to frown. So the reason for getting these Botox injections is so that you avoid having the wrinkles and the kind of frown lines. But it also means that then when you ask people to imitate an angry expression, participants who have had these Botox injections are unable to kind of form this sort of angry scowl simply because those muscles have been inhibited. When you put people in the scanner, you find that those participants that have had Botox injections show lower amygdala activation than participants without the Botox, and obviously those who are fully able to make this angry expression, suggesting that the expression is providing some kind of feedback of the emotional state that the participant is in. Now, in a kind of classic paradigm to try and study the effects of facial expressions on emotions, participants would typically be asked to adopt a smile or a frown, and there is some evidence that this leads to more positive effect when people are smiling, and consequently more negative effect when people are forming a frown expression. And if you think about it now, can you see any problems with running these sort of experiments? So particularly why might this not give you a particularly reliable measure of whether facial feedback is actually explaining emotion? And one reason is the demand characteristics. So for example, if you are thinking that you're sat in an experiment and you're being told to put your face into a smile, and then the experimenter asks you a question about how you feel, it's perhaps likely that you know that you're expected to say that you feel happier under these conditions. So it's important in this sort of research that you need to create some sort of task whereby you can examine the responses of people without them anticipating or expecting that you're interested in their emotional responses. So in one quite nice attempt to address this, Fritz Strack did a relatively clever experiment where they realized that if you ask people to hold a pen in their mouths in two different ways, this could elicit just these sort of kind of smiling and frowning expressions that you want. So if you look at the images at the bottom of the screen, in one condition, participants would hold the tip of the pen, and this would induce a smiling expression, whereas in the other condition, you would be asked to hold it whilst it's contacting your lips, which would form a more of a kind of a frown and a sad expression from this. And participants are then given a nice kind of appropriate cover story for why they're doing this to avoid any expectation of the emotion effects. So maybe if these participants then experienced emotion, it would be perhaps more believable. So in this experiment, they then asked participants to watch some cartoons and simply rate how amusing they found these cartoons that they were watching. And the key take home from this research was that they find that participants reported being more amused and found the cartoons funnier when they were holding a pen in the way that induced or forced them into holding this smile. Although the kind of evidence for the facial feedback hypothesis seems convincing when you present it in this way, it turns out to be rather tricky to replicate this effect. And the facial feedback hypothesis has been a pretty considerable source of debate, and academic fisticuffs have ensued over trying to understand whether this is a genuine effect. And this culminated with a publication in 2016 of an attempt by 17 independent separate labs to replicate the cartoon funniness effects by Strack et al. And this revealed that facial expressions had effectively no significant effect on emotional responses. So in the replication study here, led by E.J. Wagenmakers of the University of Amsterdam, these 17 labs gathered data from a collected sample of 1,894 participants, and you end up with 9 of the labs found small effects that were in the same direction as the Strack et al. Paper. So in other words, when you induce somebody to smile, they perceive the cartoons as being funnier. whereas 8 of them found effects that actually went in the opposite direction. When you average those together, there was no significant effect, or no significantly different effect from 0. And indeed, you find this facial feedback hypothesis is highly controversial in terms of the scope of emotions that it could possibly account for, and also the conditions required for facial expressions to result in emotional responses. But that's certainly not stopping Fritz Strack, who disagrees with principally how the replication was conducted. Some issues over the fact that they gave videotaped instructions to the participants. So this is a kind of a debate that continues to rage on at the moment. What about looking for the neural regions that are implicated in emotions, and whether this can try to help explain exactly where emotions are coming from? And the neural evidence points to essentially two main things: that there tend to be basic sort of positive and negative states, and emotions differ in terms of their intensity or arousal. A little bit more specifically, you find that the amygdala appears to play a special role in fear, and is critical for fear conditioning and escape and avoidance learning. And this is something I shouldn't need to say again, but it's clear that this region, the amygdala, is not only implicated in fear. Perhaps more appropriately, it's activated for motivationally salient information. You have the orbitofrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate gyrus, which appears to mediate responses to sort of social violations and maybe the kind of neural substrate of anger. You have the temporal pole of the right hemisphere, seems to be associated with emotions such as sadness and other emotions related to kind of negative affect, and is particularly implicated in withdrawal avoidant responses. The anterior portion of the insula, which is located in the olfactory bulb, as well as the anterior cingulate gyrus, seems to be associated with feelings of disgust. But again, the insula does much more than disgust, and the emotion of disgust involves much more than just the insula. We also have some evidence that points to what's known as affective asymmetry. So this is essentially the idea that affective and motivational responses are distinguished according to brain hemispheres. So specifically, you have approach-motivated and typically positive affect experiences associated with greater activation of the frontal and anterior temporal regions of the left hemisphere, whereas avoidance-motivated and typically negative affect is associated with greater activation in corresponding regions, but are now on the right hemisphere. And if you're wondering why I'm kind of careful to say approach and avoidance rather than simply referring to positive and negative affect, it's because approach and avoidance appear to map on more appropriately to each hemisphere. So for example, if you look at the emotion of anger, this is an emotion that is negative in valence, but it's also approach motivated. And notably, if you look at neural activation when people are in angry states, this is associated with greater left hemispheric activation. So clearly mapping onto regions associated with approach rather than mapping onto negatively valenced regions. However, and this is a really important sort of take-home message from this, there doesn't appear to be a single brain region that is responsible for a specific emotion. So it's certainly not the case that there's any kind of inside-out character sitting in the brain pulling the strings or placing the ball somewhere for joy and sadness. I think we can also go as far as suggesting that there don't tend to be any neural fingerprints for a single emotion. So there's not a single distinct pattern of responses that reliably map on to one single emotion. Okay, this is part 3 of the lecture, focusing on social cognition and how this can lead to differentiated emotions. So although we've looked at the fact that physiology and neurosystems clearly seem to have some kind of involvement in emotion, it seems a stretch for our emotions to be able to be purely derived from physiology. There must be some kind of greater role for cognition and appraisals of the situation and context. So in the following section, we're going to review some of the theories that address the role of cognitive processes in affect. Specifically, we're going to focus on some interruption theories, matching theories, how emotions can be derived based on outcomes, how emotions can function as essentially kind of managers of the goals and kind of self-regulatory, and finally a little bit on appraisal theories. Now, most of these theoretical perspectives are relatively unrelated to each other, so we're going to focus on each of these in turn. And let's begin by considering the role of cognition and arousal. Now, one of the early sort of theories focused on the importance of context was proposed by Schachter and Singer. So if you recall, in the seminal Schachter and Singer experiment, subjects were administered an injection of epinephrine, and this caused them then to experience essentially an undifferentiated state of physiological arousal. And they would then go and interpret their own subjective emotional experience based on how they perceived the context in which that arousal occurred. Now, in the Schachter and Singer experiment, this dose of epinephrine makes you aroused. But how do we actually get aroused outside of the lab? And to answer this question, in stepped George Mandler, and he essentially proposed that physiological arousal results from the occurrence of perceptual or cognitive discrepancy. So we become aroused whenever our expectations are violated, our attentions are frustrated, or any kind of habitual behavior that we're showing is disrupted. And this state of arousal is undifferentiated with respect to the stimulus situation. So basically, all that means is that we feel some kind of arousal, but it's never indicative of some particular emotion. So this arousal then elicits greater attentional activity. So the subject would then scan the environment to work out what's the cause of this discrepancy. And once the source of the discrepancy has been determined, the arousal state is then interpreted by the actor. And again, this interpretation is shaped by the current situational context. For example, if they're just happily walking down the street and this automatic habitual response of walking is interrupted by you tripping on the pavement, you would then next interpret how much has this interrupted our goal. And if we're doing something habitual that's relatively unimportant, our goal was to simply walk from A to B, nobody was around, then it's not really much of an interruption. Whereas Mandler's perspective was, if the goal is more complex and your goal is to walk from A to B, but you're also there impressing a date, and you trip up right in front of them, and you now have the perception that they might see you as being clumsy and silly, then the arousal that you experience will be much greater because it's hindering that long-term complex goal. Next we have matching theory. So other theories are focused more on the role of our prior expectations on emotions. For example, by showing that perceptions of power can influence the typical emotions that people experience, and also the kind of emotions that we expect to experience, both in current and future social interactions. Specifically, a lot of the research in this domain is focused on power asymmetries, and this has shown that high power, so a perception of having high power, is associated with much greater approach motivation and consequently greater positive effect, as well as left frontal activation, greater release of dopamine, which is a reward-related neurotransmitter, whereas in contrast, low power is associated with much greater kind of avoidance behavior, inhibited emotions, and negative affect. And also the release of cortisol and norepinephrine. So these are sort of stress-related responses. So simply having some kind of expectation over the emotions that we're likely to experience can have an influence. Other theories have also focused on the way that emotions can be reliably predicted from how we understand and appraise the causes of both positive and negative outcomes. So Specifically, this is the focus of Bernard Wiener's attributional model of achievement, motivation, and the best place to look at this is if you go to page 175 of the textbook, and figure 6.4. So this is going back a few chapters, but it should familiarize yourself with the kind of basic model. And Wiener's theory deals with the perceived causes of success and failure. So the characteristics of our kind of causal thinking and the subsequent emotional experiences that result from these appraisals that we make. And according to this model, a person would perform a task, then they would make a judgment of whether there's been a kind of success or a failure, so what kind of outcome. Then you would experience a very general, generic emotion of either pleasure or displeasure. So if something's been successful, we feel happy about it. If it's been a failure, we might feel sad about it. After this, we then make a slightly more complicated causal analysis to determine the locus of causality, stability, and controllability of the outcome. And it's this causal attribution that elicits more specific emotional reactions. So the locus of causality dimension refers to the perception of the cause of any event as either being internal or external. So in other words, if a person believes that they failed an exam or a test because they didn't do enough revision, this would be an internal attribution. On the other hand, if you blame the teacher's incompetence, then you would be adopting an external attribution. So in other words, if your test result comes back as a D, you might feel guilt or shame if it's because you perceive that you didn't try enough, whereas in contrast, you would feel a different emotion of anger in the second case if you're blaming your teacher's incompetence for the poor grade. Similarly, if you ended up receiving a A grade for your test, if you think this is entirely down to your own efforts, you would experience the emotion of pride, whereas if you think your awesome teacher got you to that place, then you might feel something closer to the emotion of gratitude. So another set of theories focus on the role of emotions as kind of guiding the goals that we pursue and serving kind of regulatory function. So effectively shifting us towards whatever we think should be prioritized at a particular time. So in general, emotions can be useful for orienting our attention to goals that are deemed to be most appropriate. And if we think of ourselves as capacity limited information processors that can only focus on one thing at a time, then emotions are like this kind of alarm signal that interrupt our automatic processes and effectively say like, hey, this thing over here is more important right now, you should pay attention to it. And specifically, Carver and Scheer, these were a couple of researchers that have done a lot of very influential research on self-regulation. They proposed that emotions serve this regulatory function in goal pursuit. And these emotions differ according to whether our goals are framed as being approach or avoidance motivated. And if you think back, this is related to the regulatory focus research. So, for example, an approach process is when you're motivated to gain something such as, I want to get an A grade on this course, whereas an avoidance process refers to goals that are motivated by the desire to avoid some kind of negative outcome. So for example, imagine you're in a relationship and things might be going really poorly, and you're desperate to avoid your partner breaking up with you. Then this would be a kind of avoidance goal of not wanting to break up. So depending on how we frame these particular goals, we then experience distinct emotional responses related to our relative progress towards these goals. So for approach processes, if we're doing better than expected, then we experience emotions such as elation and eagerness. So if you think of getting all of your grades back so far in the course and you're on track for getting an A grade, you're doing better than getting your A grade, then you might feel this sense of elation and eagerness. Whereas if your grades so far are not very good and you're kind of on par for like a C or a D, then Carpenter would argue that you would feel the emotions of sadness and depression about this current progress. Whereas in contrast, if we're failing in our goal to avoid something, such as our partner rejecting us, then our emotional responses typically reflect anxiety and fear. And it signals a need that we need to redouble our efforts on this task. So that might be the case of buying some roses or saying those apologies. Whereas in contrast, if we're doing well and we're reducing the chance of this rejection, then we're likely to feel a sense of relief and calmness. So an important regulatory function of these discrete emotions is to carefully modulate the degree of engagement or effort people are willing to exert. So if you consider an example where you set yourself the goal of writing an assignment over the next 3 days, and we'll consider this as an approach process. And imagine that on day 1 you sit down to start typing and you get off to an incredible start and come up with a kind of perfect idea, and you are way ahead of the planned schedule. Consequently, you should feel this sort of sense of delight or elation. And kind of ironically, what this serves to do is to encourage you to kind of coast or relax a little bit. So you would still invest effort on the task, but potentially less than before. And it's these feelings of pleasure that signal that it's safe for you to direct your attention elsewhere now that this kind of primary goal is taken care of. Now, other theories focus more on the interpretations of the personal significance attached to a situation. One of the most famous theories was put forward by Richard Lazarus. And Lazarus essentially began with the assumption that emotions serve some kind of adaptive function, so to promote survival. And as with anything, why else would we have them if there wasn't some kind of evolutionary benefit to them? So according to Lazarus, we begin by making what's known as a primary appraisal of the personal relevance of the situation. So does the environment relate to our own goals and concerns? And does the situation have potentially positive or negative implications for us? And this leads to some kind of relatively primitive emotional response that essentially causes us to want to approach things that are good and avoid things that are harmful. We then engage in a secondary appraisal regarding our resources that we have to cope with the situation. It's this that results in slightly more kind of fine-grained specific emotions. And it's important to note here that Lazarus's model was largely interested in explaining our responses to threatening stimuli or threatening situations. Hence the focus here is on our ability to cope. But he proposed that we then focus on ways in which we can influence the situation directly through problem-focused coping to avoid threats. And we also engage in emotion-focused coping that deals with regulating and controlling our own emotional state. But the core point here is that our appraisal of, firstly, the personal significance of the situation, followed by our appraisal of resources to cope with it, can lead to some form of coping response, which in turn leads to different emotional responses.